Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 1st, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. We've got a great episode for you this week, but before we dive into it, I do want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that is because of the listener support that people just like you offer. The way that we do that is through Patreon. So if you want to join the Patreon community, all you've got to do is go to patreon.com/talknerdy and pledge your support. I've also been talking to some listeners who have recommended an ad-free model, which I agree is probably the biggest perk of being a patron of the show. And it's something that I'm trying to figure out how to offer. So I'm working with my assistant on developing, the RSS feed using my hosting platform to be able to do an ad-free version and determining at what level the ad-free version would come in on Patreon. So watch this space because maybe even as early as next week, we will have something offered for you at a certain Patreon level or above. And I'm trying to figure out just what that is. If you have any recommendations, let me know. Hopefully they get to me on time, maybe at the $5 or more level per episode. Makes sense. Maybe that's probably a good way to recoup. I'm not sure, but really that's the income model of the show. It's individuals just like you who pledge your support because you offset the cost to individuals who can't afford to pay. That's what patrons of the arts do. And also, selling ad space, which, hello, we live in a consumerist world of marketing and horribleness, but that is how it works. And luckily, I get to work with some really cool advertisers. I'm especially fond of the one that I'm going to tell you about later in the show, Nature. But let's get into the meat of the show this week. So I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Kathryn Paige Harden. She actually goes by Paige. She's a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the director of the Developmental Behavior Genetics Lab and co-director of the Texas Twin Project. We talk about her new book, which is called The Genetic Lottery: Why DNA Matters for Social Equality. So we're going to be taking some preconceived notions, flipping them on their head, talking about genetics in a whole new way from a social justice perspective. It's a really good one. Stick around. I know you're going to like it. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Kathryn Paige Harden. Paige, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm really excited to talk about your new book, The Genetic Lottery: Why DNA Matters for Social Equality. And I can imagine that even titling this book might have felt a little bit fraught because it's such a loaded topic. It's a topic that obviously, for very good reason, there is a lot of not just intellectual argument about, but emotional argument about. And of course, your ultimate thesis here is one of equity and one of kind of social justice, which in some ways flies in the face of a lot of historical social or genetic psychology, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, you're totally right about the title. The first part of it, The Genetic Lottery, was the working title all along, but the subtitle, how to convey such a complex method or message in something that would fit on the cover of a book, was something that we went round and round about, because there is this association that genetics is somehow antithetical to social justice concerns. And so how to bring up the topic of equality and sort of explode people's priors from the very beginning, but also invite them to stay with me for this argument was our challenge, even just coming up with the title and the marketing of the book.
I can imagine that even sort of working in the position that you do, right? So you're a psychologist at UT and a behavioral geneticist. So you sort of work at the intersection between, the genetics, the biology of, heritability, and then the psychology of sort of, who are we? What makes us us? What is identity? And all of these things. I can imagine that even just working in that field, there must be a fair amount of explanation, a fair amount of maybe not pushback, and I bring that up because I recently had on the show, actually it might have been over a year now, if people remember when we had Dr. Shane Campbell Staton on the show, he was talking quite a bit about he's an ecologist and a geneticist, studying tuskless elephants in Mozambique and lizards across the globe and looking at genetics. But, as a Black man, he was saying, do you understand how hard it is that some of the positions in my field, some of the endowed chairs, some of the buildings are still named for eugenicists? And this is like the world I operate in. Like, it's
Yes. And it's
so
not just
entrenched.
buildings, it's statistical tools that you use every day.
Right,
You hear
right.
about F statistics and they're named after Fisher, or even the concept of variance, which is so fundamental to the statistical study of difference in any field. You can't really do statistics without thinking about correlations or variances. And all of that was invented by people who were inventing these statistical tools as eugenic tools. And so how you can reclaim that science for more liberatory ends is the necessary challenge that we have to address.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. Like when I think about the sort of classic, like the Spearmans and the, like you mentioned, and the Fishers and like these individuals who like developed all of these really sophisticated and useful, statistical tools. But what was to what end? What was their focus? I often, when having these conversations with people, because my background's also psychology, but not, not behavioral genetics, I often have the conversation about intelligence testing and sort of all of the architects of intelligence testing, because the vast majority of them were also eugenicists, and they were specifically trying to develop a tool to kind of, quote, prove the superiority of the white race at the time. And to me, that's a very obvious version of this kind of dark era of psychology and biology. But you're right, even just the what we think of as mathematical, almost like, quote, purer or somehow like less socially fraught, like even those tools were developed by these people.
Yeah, it's really kind of inescapable in a lot of ways. I wrote an essay earlier this year and it was titled, "What do we do with the science of terrible men?" And
Mhm.
I got the title as a riff off of an essay by Emily Nussbaum, who was the TV critic for the New Yorker. Um, and she wrote a book called I Like to Watch, which is a book of television criticism, and it's really fun to read. But she has an essay in there about, being a viewer and a professional critic in the time of the Me Too era. What do you do with the art of Louis C.K. or Woody Allen or Roman Polanski? When you can't pretend as your job that it doesn't exist, but using it uncritically or talking about it as if the artist didn't do reprehensible things is also dissatisfactory. And I really like the essay because it avoids any pat answers. It's grappling with the complexities of that. And I thought, well, this is the same conversation that we are having, or we need to be having in science about, we're going to take what we can that's useful from you, but we're not going to do it in a way that, tacitly props up your legacy, given the kind of moral legacy that you have, and just kind of grappling with that. I don't have a pat answer to it. I just think it's a conversation that we need to be having.
Gosh, and I have to say, like, to be 100% honest, I wish that this were a conversation that were being had more often, but unfortunately, I don't think it is. I mean, I think, you always see around the Nobel times all of the articles about how all the Nobels go to men, and these are all the women who were overshadowed and whose work, actually fundamentally set the stage or the groundwork for, Dr. So-and-so's work to later become the Nobel. But I don't think that we very often are having a conversation about, like you said, sort of like it's very overt with like a Woody Allen. Like, what do we do with his art? And especially given that like his movies are about like they're like
Yeah.
Pygmalion movies about like rape and
About,
having,
yeah.
it's like
Yes. And
relationships with young
and
women.
creepy sexual power dynamics. Yes.
Totally. Like
100% true.
it's pretty overt, and so you're right. I think that there's been sort of like an obvious grappling with that in the media, but I worry that a lot of scientists are like, well, a tool's a tool and it has nothing to do with the person, and ultimately we just yeah, of course, if we were to really dissect anybody from the past, there's problematic, but these are important things and let's just move on. Like, I feel like that is sort of the, I don't know, the perspective that I often hear.
Yeah, I think that's true, that it's easy to say, well, there's nothing we can do about the fact that they were horrible people or they did the horrible things. And, we're not going to stop running correlation coefficients. So let's just move on. I teach intro psych, and increasingly I feel the responsibility to frame things for undergrads who are coming to this material for the first time with the history now as like an afterthought, but how can we bake it in more into when we talk about correlation, let's also talk about why these tools were invented. And that's obviously a work in progress, and I can always do better with that. But I wonder if, that's really the way forward, is training the next generation, the next cohort of scientists, such that they don't discover this, like their fifth year of their PhD, like, oh my gosh, I never knew this, but it was kind of steeped into their education in this very foundational way from the beginning.
I agree, because then it means that they're going to be thinking critically about every research decision they make. They're going to be thinking critically as they're, collecting data, as they're analyzing it, as they're publishing it, about how to contextualize things. Because the truth of the matter is, the way that we teach psychology right now, whether it's at the undergraduate level or at the graduate level, is that we offer this course called History and Systems, where
Which is like the 1 hour credit that
yeah,
like everyone sleeps through.
Yeah, and then we try to contextualize everything historical there, and there are amazing professors who teach it, and they really, hopefully you have a good professor who grapples with some of these issues within that course, but ultimately we don't learn about it in stats, and we definitely don't learn about it as we're, anytime a concept comes up, we're not grappling with that concept's historical contextualization. We're taking it at face value. And I think that's the problem, right? Like you said, if the first time somebody learns about a correlation coefficient, or the first time somebody learns about some concept within their field, and it's contextualized like, oh, and by the way, this is the bro that developed this. Let me tell you a little bit about how he was problematic,
Yeah. Or
and
the
then you might
first
start to
time,
think about it more.
yeah. I was going to say, or the first time you learn about genes, it's not in the context of Mendel's pea plants, right?
You're so right.
I think there's this movement to think about how much of our genetic determinism, this idea that genes determine things, is set up by the frame by which we teach high school biology, that people encounter genes and they encounter Mendel's peas and they encounter, maybe PKU, which is a single gene disorder. And they're not introduced to the idea of lots of genes with little effects that are probabilistic and depend on the environment until much later, if at all. Versus if we started with our high school biology curriculum on, well, these are the genes you might have heard of with ancestry, and this is why they're not race. Like if that was the beginning point and not the ending point, how much of our kind of intuitions in the public writ large around genetics would be different. So I'm just excited to see where that goes if people start to change some of those high school biology curricula.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Because I do think that lots of kids come out of this like freshman biology lab. And again, like you were saying before, you taught us, or you actively teach Psych 101. I taught Psych 101 in the past, but I definitely way more often taught Bio 1 laboratories. And I was that person teaching that, that genetics lab where it was like, okay, this is simple dominance, and this is what happens when you take a red flower and a white flower and you cross them and you make a pink flower. And then how, of course, is somebody going to then think about, and they see like a baby born to, let's say like uh, individuals of different colors, and then the baby looks blended, and they probably can't imagine a Punnett square in their head.
Yeah.
A racial Punnett square. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And it
Yeah.
must be, and how could they not? Like, this is exactly how we're teaching it. So let's take a second before we dive in and really grapple with this sort of central thesis to define a few terms like genes, like DNA, like heritability, and like even when you mentioned ancestry and some of the things that we're talking about with ancestry. So DNA first and foremost, because I think that's going to be something we throw around a lot. How do you think, in terms of the listenership, the conversation that we're about to be having, how do you want to sort of contextualize that specific definition?
Yeah. So, DNA is this molecule that exists in all of your cells, and it's made up of 4 DNA letters, G, C, T, and A. And you can kind of think of it as all metaphors for DNA are kind of wrong, but one metaphor is to sort of think of it as a set of recipes for proteins. That's ultimately what genes code for. So they give instructions for your cells to make proteins, or they give instructions for the instructions. And so there's, I think the first thing that's important to note is that there's a whole complicated cellular machinery and developmental process by which DNA gets turned into things. And genetics doesn't really capture that. So we're looking at DNA, do I differ from you in my DNA sequence in some way? How that's expressed in my brain versus my body, how that genetic difference is turned on or turned off by my environment or at certain points in my life. I'm not really capturing any of that information when I'm measuring DNA. I'm really just measuring the sequence of nucleotides, these DNA letters that exist in your cell. And most humans are, very similar. Most of our DNA is the same across all humans. The exact number differs on your estimate, but the most commonly cited is 99.9% the same. But when we look at that 0.1% that's left over, we're looking at what are called variants. And variants are differences. To what extent does your DNA sequence look different than mine? And so behavioral genetics, which is my field of study, is connecting those DNA differences between us to differences between us in some aspect of our behavior or some aspect of our psychology. And that is a process that is scientifically difficult for reasons that, your listeners can probably already intuit. Unlike the plant geneticists, we don't get to do super controlled experiments. We're looking at free range humans and how they differ genetically and how they differ in their lives. But also, I think a topic of enduring fascination. How is the DNA hand that we're dealt? How does that shape things that we think of as pretty core to our identity as people, our personalities, our interests, our temperaments, our behaviors, and then how do those play out in people's lives and in the societies we actually live in?
Yeah. So when we throw around terms like genetic or heritable, what specifically are we referring to? Are we referring to whether or not somebody has that particular combination of DNA? Like what I guess maybe we should take even a step back from there. So we talked about DNA as these letters, these sort of like probabilistic coding letters. What is a gene?
Yeah, so that's such an interesting question. It's like it seems like something that should have a simple answer, but in fact, people have debated the definition of a gene. So one definition of a gene is that it is a stretch of DNA that codes for a protein, so that has some function. My cell needs to make this enzyme. That enzyme, is made up of the building blocks of proteins, which are amino acids. And so there's a string of DNA that together kind of completely builds this protein.
So it's DNA within a boundary that's like meaningful.
Yes, exactly. That's meaningful from some functional purpose. And, even just, what we're often looking at are what are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are single DNA letter differences between people. And even that process of mapping SNPs to genes. Okay, you found a SNP is associated. Which gene is it in? And what does that gene do? Is often remarkably unknown. So we might have sequenced the human genome and that we can read what the letters are, but that's still far from knowing what all of the regions do and how they work together to do it. So there's a lot of kind of genetic dark matter in there where we know it's there. People have moved away from talking about it, it as junk DNA. It seems to have some purpose. But the function of stretches of DNA are really unclear for a lot of our genomes.
We've got the DNA, which are these like individual letters, these, kind of very basic, like you said, recipes for recipes or instructions for instructions. We've got the genes, which are more, I guess, can be thought of as like loci, as like a region. Like a gene is actually something we can point to that has a beginning and an end. So it's a stream of these DNA letters that if we were to like remove it would still potentially be able to do something, like it codes for something as a whole. And then we've got, when we take that word gene and we turn it into genetic, I think that's where things get complicated, because when we talk about things being genetic in nature, we're not just referring to the gene.
Yeah. So I think people use genetic in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about a lot of words like this, I think, genetic or heritable or eugenic. So sometimes when people that say something is genetic, they mean that it's genetically determined and that it's best understood at the level of what's going on with your DNA. So for instance, if we think about like a chromosomal abnormality, if we think about Down syndrome, right? So we think of Downs as a genetic disorder because it is caused by having 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. It is only caused by that. If you have 3 copies, you have Downs. It's determined by that. And there's really no way to understand the phenomenon without making reference to something that's happening in your DNA. Where we get into trouble is when we try to apply that use of the word genetic to something that doesn't work like Downs, something like personality. Is personality quote unquote genetic? And that's where I think something can be genetically caused, in the sense that differences in your DNA can make it more or less likely for you to have differences in your personality. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily best understood at the level of your DNA, or that it's even determined by your DNA. So I talk about this in my book. We actually have a whole chapter on what it means for something to be caused by genes. We get in a lot of trouble when we take our kind of intuitions about what it means for something to be quote unquote genetic, and then we apply them to these more complicated social and behavioral phenotypes like personality or intelligence, which we can't understand without reference to a social context, which aren't understood, purely as a genetic phenomenon, but are related to your DNA. And it's that things can be related to DNA without being narrowly genetic. That is a really hard kind of intuition for people to grapple with often.
I'm almost in my head right now seeing like a Venn diagram of sort of like your genes, of your environment, of the social structure, the culture within you, what you live. But when I see this sort of Venn diagram, it's like so heavily overlapped that it's almost the same circle. And there's only like these tiny slivers on the outside that are purely any one thing. And I think that's really like one of the things that I often think about, because I work, I'm working on my PhD right now, actually in clinical psychology, and I work with cancer patients. I work in a cancer center doing therapy with people with cancer. And I think when we think about cancer, which is one of these very kind of classic things where it's your own body cells that are kind of betraying you, and where there are so many genetic markers, but at the same time, there are so many environmental inducers. There are viruses that cause cancer. We know about smoking can cause cancer, and environmental toxins can change the probability. And so I think about something like a BRCA gene, because I feel like most people are kind of aware of this idea that there's a BRCA gene, which can mean, if somebody is BRCA positive, they have a higher risk, or their probability is different than somebody who is BRCA negative. But it doesn't mean you're gonna get breast cancer. It means you have some of the, ingredients for breast cancer, and you might get breast cancer, and you might need to be more concerned about getting breast cancer than somebody who's BRCA negative. But people who are BRCA negative get breast cancer all the time, and people who are BRCA positive don't get breast cancer. And that's something as simple as a coding region and some environmental factors. And that doesn't even bring the complexity of the social side of it really even into the equation. It's when we talk about things like you said, like intelligence, personality, I don't know, achievement, athletic ability, things like that. I mean, they're so much more complicated even than a BRCA gene, which is already so freaking complicated.
Yeah, yeah. I have so many thoughts in response to that. The first thing I just
Okay,
want to
good. Please,
say is
please.
that when I was, my PhD is originally in clinical psych too, and that was one of my practicum in graduate school. I was working at the UVA Cancer Center with therapy with cancer patients. And that is such difficult work and important work. So, props to you for doing it.
Oh gosh,
It was a
thanks.
really life-changing experience for me,
Yeah,
actually. I was
I
very
love it.
young and I was like 23 and had no idea what I was doing as a therapist. And then
Oh
all
yeah,
of a
that
sudden I
sounds
was,
really hard to be around people with like metastatic disease, some of whom who are dying. Yeah, that would be really
yeah,
tough. That
but really
young.
transformative. The other thing is
Mhm.
just thinking about like even simple things like BRCA increases your risk of breast cancer but doesn't determine it. You run up quickly against the fact that humans can sometimes be good at probabilistic reasoning or thinking in terms of gray and uncertainty,
I'm like,
and
sometimes
then
or seldom.
sometimes
Yeah.
not. Right?
Yeah.
So, and we've experienced this around the pandemic too about like, how does vaccination change your risk of serious illness versus getting it at all? Or how does masking work or not? We as humans, we're such bad Bayesian reasoners and we're so bad at thinking about base rates and just grappling with uncertainty, I think is something that humans don't like to do. And then they're not even taught from the very beginning about genetics as being this kind of realm of uncertainty and confidence intervals and in probabilities. And so it is easy for people to fall into this frame of like, I have the BRCA gene or I don't, I am going to get cancer or I'm not. And that again is with one, just one, something that's, a monogenic thing, like, right, that this is, one mutation of one gene. The other thing, one of the earliest large scale genetic studies of lung cancer, one of the genes that you get identified as being associated with the risk of lung cancer is a variant in your nicotinic receptor in your brain. And why is that, right? It's because you find nicotine more rewarding and then you smoke more. And I think that's an example of like, we can never cleanly separate genes and the environment because some of our genes operate through exposing us to the environment, right? Like I like cigarettes and then I smoke them more and then I'm exposed to this carcinogenic exposure. Um, so,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
not
that's
just
so
that these things are
interesting.
probabilistic. It's that, some of our environments are preying on our genetic vulnerabilities and some of our genes are operating through us seeking out certain environments. There's a great paper I love that says like when G equals E, which is like so many of the genes that we look at are actually getting at the social and environmental exposures that are then relevant for health. So I agree with you that Venn diagram, we are teaching examples. We teach them because they're really clean, but they're really clean because they're the exception that proves the rule, right? That, most of the time the gene and the genome and the environment and society and health and disease are smushed together in these really complicated, messy ways.
Yeah, and I think that we often, we hear these pithy sort of phrases thrown around like nature versus nurture. Like how much of this is nature and how much and we always talk about it in terms of some sort of like weird equation. Like it's this percent nature and that percent nurture and together they make 100%. But I think what that conversation removes and simplifies, and even I'm going to simplify it, is this idea of like how much of this is genetically coded, how much of this is like, quote, environmentally induced. And when I say environmentally, I literally mean like in the environment, like exposure to toxins, nutrition, like comorbidities, like other disease states, infections, and how much of it is sort of social. And I think that's the conversation that's often missing. Weirdly, like as psychologists, I think that that's like, well, duh. But I feel like in other fields of medicine and in sort of like other kind of health conversations, this idea of culture, of the family unit, of poverty, of, religion or faith, of, gosh, there's like a million of race, basically this, as we know, which is a social construct. It's not a genetic truism. It's just a social construct, but it has real ramifications, that these kind of social dynamics actually feed in such a meaningful way. And I think maybe the reason that that's not grappled with as much in basic like biomedical research is because it's a very complicated, and complicating things is something that scientists don't like. They want to, get rid of all the variables. And then B, I think it makes us have to really think long and hard about ourselves in a way that we don't like to do.
Yes. I mean, I think you're right about that. I think psychology, we use this phrase, the biopsychosocial model, really is, a truism that of course everything is this intersection between the biological and the psychological and the social, which includes socially stratified exposures to environments. The challenge then is, how do you go beyond lip service to that to actually doing the science that integrates these things? And that's hard to do. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I feel like people who are more more oriented towards studying the social or studying the environmental, um, really can shy away from integrating genetic tools into their research because they fear, perhaps with good reason, that it's going to distract from the attention to the social. Whereas what I'm trying to call attention to is the ways in which we can use the biological technology to help us illustrate what's going on with the social and environmental. Like, if it really is almost always an interaction between these things, um, it it hurts our study of the social to ignore the biological, and it hurts our study of the biological to ignore the social. We always need both, and not just paying lip service to both, but really thinking about how to integrate variables across these levels of analysis in our research designs.
Yeah. And so, when we think about sort of the central thesis of your book, like you said the working title was always, or the title was actually always the working title. So maybe let's now take that sort of stride into this conversation about the quote genetic lottery, about the idea. And I think about this quite a lot in my own personal life because I have a loved one who has a lot of congenital neurodevelopmental issues. And I think about how much harder things were for her than they were for me. And I use that phrase a lot, the genetic lottery, because we had a very similar upbringing. We had a similar social environment. And in some way, I mean, we're not twins, but in some ways it's similar to the twin studies that you look at, where I know that I have privilege simply because I'm neurotypical. And I know that she struggles in a way simply because she's neurodivergent, and like pretty significantly so. And I think long and hard quite often about uh, uh, just about how people sometimes don't realize it because it's a sort of hidden disability, and they think that these are character flaws, or they look at it like, well, you just work harder, or you're more goal oriented, or you have these skills. And like one of the biggest grapplings I've often had within my family are conversations about like, well, if she would just, and it's like, maybe she's trying as hard as she can, and this is her limitation. And I think that sort of is that personal experience, I think, for me personally, encapsulates one of the major sort of thesis statements of this book, right?
Yes, I'm so glad that you used the word privilege in there. I think that there are these conversations that we, are increasingly had, particularly amongst sort of, in certain circles in America, around the nature of privilege and how function works, right? And we can think about white privilege, or we can think about class privilege, or we can think about the privilege that's afforded to you if you're cisgender or if you're heterosexual. And with our conversations about privilege, what are we saying there? We're saying that there's certain characteristics that people happen to have, and they might have it by virtue of parentage and descent, right? Like I'm white by virtue of my parentage. They might have it by virtue of, some sort of biology. Some people really identify with their sexual orientation as a biological or innate thing about them. Or it might be some sort of chosen aspect of their identity. And then we're saying, okay, there's differences in identities, and we have structured society in such a way that some identities are privileged and they have an easier time going through life than other identities. And that frame is the frame that I want to take to our conversation around other genetically influenced differences. So we can see sort of like the privilege frame being expanded in many ways around some of our mental health conditions, right? Like some of, the neurodiversity community around ADHD and autism spectrum disorders, or around physical disabilities such as deafness. We can see this expansion of the privilege discourse. Like, in what way do we just privilege the hearing in the way that we set up media or the way that classes are set up? How do we need to accommodate those differences? But we've had a really hard time adopting that discourse of privilege, which really centers the responsibility of society to accommodate difference and celebrate difference, rather than sort of inferiorizing individual people. We've had a lot of trouble adapting that discourse to thinking about genetics writ large, and so that is exactly the frame that I want people to walk away from my book thinking about. There's a chapter at the end of my book that's called Difference Without Hierarchy, which is really thinking about what if we took the frame of privilege and interrogated, happening to have the sort of cognitive skills that are really prized in formal education or in STEM education right now. Like, is that a way that we can think about how certain psychological functionings are sort of disproportionately valued in the way that we've set up our economy? And if we interrogate that as a source of privilege, sort of like what follows from that in terms of societal recommendations. I've learned through experience, just talking about this book, that can be, that's a really different way of thinking about genetics for a lot of people. It's really a stretch to go
I'm
from
not surprised.
a predominant frame in sort of pushing back against eugenics has been really to emphasize genetic sameness. But if you think about other sort of liberation movements in America, they're not saying there's no difference here. They're saying there is difference here, but we shouldn't privilege one form of human functioning over another. And so let's take that frame into thinking about psychological difference.
And I think sometimes the logical fallacy that I see over and over, especially in I'm thinking to a conversation. I work on another podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and we have these email forums, and we get so many emails a day. And every so often, an email captures something, and so some of us will engage with the listener, and sometimes it becomes this long back and forth and sort of an intellectual exercise. And right now, there's a very long back and forth being observed between the host of the show and a fan, a listener, about transgender individuals. And the logical fallacy that I'm seeing over and over in the listener is this sort of appeal to nature fallacy, this idea. And I think this speaks even greater to what you were just talking about, this idea that we have a social hierarchy and a social structure that rewards certain people and calls them typical or calls them normative or normal, and then actually punishes people who don't fit within that quote normal, because our structure itself is built around the normalcy. So it's just think about physical disability. It's like a perfect example. The difference between somebody who walks on their legs and somebody who uses a wheelchair. And you build a city that only has stairs. All of a sudden, you are privileging people who walk on their two legs, and you are excluding all the people in wheelchairs. And we learned this a long time ago. This is why we have the ADA. This is why here in America, for my non-American listeners, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it requires that there's access for people. You can't just have public buildings with only stairs. And it's such an easy concept to understand that way, but the truth is all of our social systems are organized based on decisions that were made by people in power, not based on some sort of like quote natural order that would have just self-organized that way even if we had done it all over again each time. It's like, of course not. What if the king or the queen had been somebody in a wheelchair? You know what I mean? It's like it would have been a totally different kingdom at that point.
Yes, it's so true. And I'm so glad that you brought up the ADA, because I think it is, it's a piece of legislation that I'm continually fascinated by because of its conception of what is equality. So if you read the text of the ADA, it says that people are, they have equal access to and enjoyment of places of public accommodation. So what you're not trying to equalize mode of transportation, right? You're not saying we want to make it so that everyone has equal walking or running ability. We're saying that, and we're not saying that equality is assured simply by treating everyone exactly the same, right? Like you can't put a set of stairs in and be like, well, everyone has to go up the same stairs. So like, this is equality of opportunity. You can't be blind to difference, right? Like you have to think about, well, given difference, what do people need? And what do people need so that they can participate as equals in relationship with each other? There's just kind of this notorious story, which I actually don't know if it's true, but about so it might be just apocryphal, but like Mother Teresa trying to renovate a building in New York that was going to be a home for um men who were I think either who were poor or recovering, and anyways they didn't want to put an elevator in the building, and they were like, well, we can just carry people up and down the stairs when they need to be carried. And the city of New York was like, no, you can't. Like, that is not providing conditions that are reflective of people's dignity or conducive to them participating as equals. What is an elevator that accommodates that difference. So that is the frame that I want to think about in terms of like cognitive skill or non-cognitive skill, which is what economists call it, and our economy as a structure, right? Which is not how not necessarily how do we equalize everyone in terms of our psychological functioning, but what would an economy look like that is the ADA equivalent of an economy around psychological difference? That's, I think, a really interesting question to consider.
And when you so going back to this kind of conversation about the genetic lottery, is that particularly or specifically what you are referring to? This idea that like society over, hundreds and thousands of years, depending on where you live and what what the kind of that geographic area's historical roots are, has developed systems, and those systems favored certain people and they denigrated or even eschewed other people. And it was all based on decisions that were made by people in power. And ultimately, now we're netted out at a place where certain people, based on their experiences in the world, have a easier go at it, and other people have more hardship simply by virtue of the structure. Basically, it's like walking into a playground. Does that playground only have things you can grab with your hands? Does it only have things you can do with your feet? Does it only have things that are verbally reactive? Does it only, and if you're not built that way, either that playground's for you or it's not. So society is this giant playground, and different people are entering into it genetically and environmentally and socially, but with this combination of these things, having won the genetic lottery or having lost it.
Yeah,
And they had no choice in that.
Yeah. So the genetic lottery, it works as a metaphor on a couple of different levels. And, one is it's a play on what John Rawls, a political philosopher, called the natural lottery, which is just like, people have different talents and abilities and interests and functions, both physical and psychological. And a lot of that stuff is, it's the lottery of birth. And that lottery of birth could be you happen to be born into a family that had the resources to inculcate certain things, or you happen to be born with a certain set of genetic variants that gave you an easier time developing skills that are socially favored. So there's this kind of, kind of philosophical tradition that then asks people to consider, well, if we really take seriously the role that luck plays in our lives in developing these kind of skills and functionings, how much does that undermine this narrative of like, I earned my success, I deserve it, right? Which I think is a really kind of persistent drumbeat in sort of American meritocracy.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially in America. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's also the ways in which the genetic lottery works just as a metaphor for the randomness of reproduction, right? So, I think when people think about genetics, they think about similarities between parents and children. And what they often forget is that half of the genetic variance in a population exists within families. It exists between parents and children, between brothers and sisters. And so there's this lottery of Mendelian randomization. There's this lottery of which genetic variants your kids happen to inherit. And scientifically, that lottery, that randomness of genetic inheritance is one of our best allies in terms of trying to disentangle this complicated mess of genes versus environments. In a world where everything is correlated with everything else, the introduction of randomness as a natural experiment is, a scientist can be a scientist's best friend. So it's called the genetic lottery because I want to call attention to both the moral arbitrariness of a lottery, right? Like no one thinks that they're like a more morally deserving person because they happen to have a winning lottery ticket. The structural arbitrariness of a lottery, we can decide to pay lottery winners $5 or $500 million, right? Like what the payout for a lottery is a decision that someone made. And then also the scientific possibilities afforded by the randomness of a lottery is another thing that I think is a really important point pragmatically in terms of how do we move forward scientifically.
Well, and what's funny too is I'm thinking about this like lottery metaphor and I'm like going deep on it. And one of the things I think everybody kind of knows in the back of their head and they go, oh, whenever they think about it, they roll their eyes a little, is that like when a lottery winner wins $500 million, their take home is actually more like 200 million because like so much of it goes back in the form of taxes.
I like that.
If we did that, if we were a little bit more like, you're on the lucky side of things and like your luck means, and we sort of do in a way, like people who have more earning potential, people who have higher wage jobs, people who are sort of like luckier to be able to do, have a greater income potential, which has to do with all these things we were talking about, neurotypicality, working in a corporate environment, having been raised in a environment that was conducive to all of the training that's necessary, having all the opportunities that were available, blah, 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 that like ultimately we should, I mean, I know that there are horrible loopholes and we actually end up like having these backward incentives, and that's a whole other economics conversation. But the system is sort of meant to be built that those people pay more. They give back in order to sort of offset the fact that there are people in this society, this fully functioning, integrative, kind of intersubjective, interpersonal society that can't, quote, contribute. I mean, that's such an American view, right? Like contribute to society. Like they don't have as much earning potential and they can't contribute to the GDP the same way.
I mean, I think everything about the pandemic has shown that our sense of whose contributions are valuable versus how we value those contributions in our current economic setup is kind of, nonsensical, right? I mean, we are experiencing massive supply chain problems. We're experiencing, as an economy, difficulties in keeping retail and restaurants open because of labor shortages, because people are like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not being appropriately compensated for it. I don't have worker protections. I don't have time off. How we call people essential workers because we feel like if we applaud them, we can get out of valuing their labor
Out of paying
appropriately
them. Yeah.
economically. And
Yeah.
I feel like we're seeing the beginnings of the end to that, which I really, really celebrate. So, there's, going back to the privilege conversation, going back to there's choices. There's not just choices about how do we redistribute earnings, after the fact. There's how are the rules of the game set up to begin with? How is the playground structured to begin with, this playground of our economy? There's a UCLA professor who's in the law school, Joseph Fishkin, whose book and work I just recently discovered. And his phrase is all about the anti-bottleneck principle, which is basically, are there bottlenecks in our economy? And I think college graduation is one of them, where we really, narrowly gate access to certain goods, to certain things. And how can that be transformed to a more pluralistic opportunity structure where even if you can't succeed in this way that has traditionally been privileged as the more neurotypical way, there is another path towards building a life of material security and dignity. And that to me, I think is a really exciting framework to think about, articulating and moving forward. What does that actually look like in practice for our economy?
And so that sort of raises for me this like really big question, this big concept to grapple with. So, one of the terms that we've sort of thrown around a little bit, but haven't really dived into yet, and it's probably because it's sort of anathema. It's sort of like one of these things that it's like a known entity that's bad. But I'm not sure that a lot. I mean, whatever, I'm talking around it a lot, but this concept of eugenics
Mm-hmm.
and this idea, and one of the things that I often bring up is there's this I remember seeing a talk once, and God, I feel so bad because I do not know who the talk was by or where I even was when I saw the talk, but it was this really striking image that they used as the intro to their talk, which was a picture. Everybody remembers libraries, right? And like, if you've ever visited an academic library and you've gone to the periodical section, that all of the journals, a year's worth or whatever, maybe 5 years worth of the journals get bound together in a book, and they all have these very like boring, like hard covers, and it'll just say the name of the journal, the volume number, and the date. And it literally was the progression of the annals of eugenics to the annals of genetics. Like this is the
Oh,
name of
that's
this
so
journal.
interesting.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
like the same journal changed its name once it was no longer fashionable, but it was the same journal with the same editors and the same publishers. And one of the things that I didn't know, I have to admit my ignorance here, until I saw this brilliant 3-part documentary series that was put on, I think, by PBS. Maybe it was a Frontline documentary series. Maybe it was an American Experience documentary series about eugenics, was that this eugenics movement, which really in many ways originated in America, and we sort of fed the German Nazi movement, like a lot of what Hitler was doing was going, those Americans, they have some good ideas. That at the beginning, there was almost like it was never viewed as a bad thing. Like early on, the genetics movement was viewed as a way to have like a happier, healthier society. It really was viewed as like a family planning movement. It was a movement around making sure that people had equality of opportunity in education and trying to understand, how can we have happier, healthier babies that are, fit for this society, and how can we make sure that people have really good opportunities? And it sort of ultimately morphed through the use of a lot of these concepts that we were talking about into this really dark and disgusting way to put people into discrete groups and say, you people fit our social view of what privilege is. You people are drags on society, so you shouldn't procreate, and you should. And then it became an even darker final solution kind of thing, where it was like, we're just going to exterminate you altogether. So it's not about procreation or our dark history in America, right? Like, not just genocide, which of course we have the Trail of Tears and we have all these examples of American genocide, but also of just discussing like sterilization behind closed doors in mental institutions and prisons and, in low income communities and, Tuskegee syphilis trials and all of these things that we can talk about. But that it's at its core, its roots were this very saccharine kind of,
Hmm.
we all want a happier, healthier society.
Yeah, and not necessarily a super politically polarized one,
No,
too,
like
right? Where
everyone was pro eugenics early
it
on.
wasn't just the right, it wasn't just the South, it was amongst people who thought of themselves as progressives. And so, on the one hand, if we're thinking about the UK, we had people like Carl Pearson, who was, like opposed to the expansion of universal education and opposed to child labor laws, but also was a feminist. And, there were people who considered themselves socialists and also eugenicists. And it is a period of time in which we're used to thinking of genetics and eugenics as right wing, which of course, obviously is because of both the Nazi Germany embrace of it and the Soviet backlash against genetics. And then we project that backwards, into the earliest part of the 20th century. It doesn't fit that narrative at all. It's very, very confusing. And even the word eugenics, is picking a sperm donor eugenic? What if you pick a sperm
Right.
donor on height?
Because
What if
Because
you,
you just
yeah.
means like good, right? Like when we think of uh, what's a good example of this? Oh, like depression or thymia. So that's a clinical term we use in psychology. Dysthymia is like it's like bad or or negative mood, and then euthymia is like a good mood. It's like a positive mood. It's like you're fine. And so eugenics was like good genes. Let's promote good genes.
Yeah. And I think, if you think about modern reproductive medicine, um, I've had friends who've gone through IVF because of infertility, and it is standard practice to choose among your IVF embryos on the basis of, basic genetic screening or even just morphological features, right? Like which embryo literally looks the best under a microscope, which I don't know how much people realize that. And so we have, if we're thinking of eugenics um, but if we're thinking of eugenics primarily in terms of changing the gene pool or changing something about the frequency of certain genetic variants, I think you run into a problem where a lot of things that people are very kind of comfortable with are part of ordinary practice, not choosing a sexual partner at random or choosing an egg donor or choosing amongst IVF embryos so that they don't have a Mendelian disorder, could be considered eugenic, but we don't think of them as deeply problematic.
Yeah. Do you think that just comes down, not just, but we both just, but not just. Do you think that comes down to the idea of like, according to whom? It's one thing when the state or when individuals in power get to make those decisions for individual citizens. It's another thing when I, as a woman, get to choose if I get pregnant and then I find out that there's a severe genetic abnormality that I can choose to have an elective abortion and say, I don't want, and this is an empowering thing that I promote, from a moral perspective, 100% all in promote this choice for women, that I don't want to carry the burden throughout life of raising this child. It's not a child yet. It's still a part of my body, and I'm choosing electively to remove that from me, because that's not a position I want to put myself in. But the minute that like my boss tells me what I have to do, or that the
Yeah, or
state
the
tells me what I
state
have,
does.
yeah,
Yeah.
then that's a completely different conversation.
Yeah. So I think that's a big part of it, which is, whose autonomy is being exercised there, or whose autonomy is being abridged. So in the book, I define eugenics in a very particular way. And I borrow the definition of philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, who links it together with racism, with sexism, with classism. And, her definition is basically the idea that there is a natural order, that it is just and necessary to base society on this natural order, that there's superior and inferior persons, and that we can justify some people having fewer freedoms or resources or welfare on the basis of them being lower in that natural order.
It's a fallacy, this idea that it's natural, right? That the order is, quote, better. And this goes back to, for anybody listening, the conversations that we had on the show previously with Angela Saini, who wrote, at length about this, both in terms of race and in terms of gender. It goes back to conversations I had with Lulu Miller, who wrote a beautiful book, Why Fish Don't Exist, about taxonomy and eugenics and the idea of natural categories that,
That's interesting.
yeah, that we often think that categories are natural, but really these are all constructs. And the person constructing them has a hell of a lot more, like they say a lot more about the person constructing them than they do about the actual, quote, natural order of things. And that, I think that's the crux, isn't it? This fallacy that there's somehow a natural, and that goes back to the conversation I was having before about the listener arguing with the host of our show about what does it mean for somebody to be trans, and is there, and they just keep perseverating on this idea that like biological sex, not gender, they're going back to this concept of sex, is a natural thing, and that it's a natural binary. And it's like, no, you're missing the fundamental point, because they're saying this is a social issue, not a biological issue. It's like, it's both. Like, it's not, you can't separate them.
It's both. I think this idea that there can be natural difference, there can be difference that occurs in the natural world, and that is different from a naturalized hierarchy, because hierarchies are, at the end of the day, about power, right? And so, there's nothing about the existence of natural difference that justifies or makes necessary a naturalized order and hierarchy of power. So what I really like about that definition of eugenics is I think it captures the atrocities that we associate with the eugenics movement. When we think about, well, what's wrong with what happened to Carrie Buck in Buck v. Bell, right? Who was forcibly sterilized on the premise that she and her children were feeble-minded.
Oh gosh, I had the woman who wrote the book, The Unfit Heiress, on the show, all about this specific story.
Specific case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's saying, there's natural differences in something that I'm calling feeble-mindedness, but what's more, that makes you an inferior person, and you don't get the right of self-determination around your family or your fertility. So people have pushed back against this definition of eugenics. And someone on Twitter was like, according to Paige, capitalism is eugenic, but embryo selection isn't. Which, I kind of like laughed a little bit at that, but also I do think it's useful to think about what are the practices in our current society that are robbing people of this right of self-determination, of their ability to form a family, of their control over their own future on the basis of their alleged inferiority. And I don't think it's the process of IVF embryo selection right now. I think it is the kind of perniciousness of our capitalist system that are doing it. And so it's a definition that seems straightforward at first, but then when you apply it to, what does that mean are the dangers of eugenics today in 2021? I think they can be different from what people immediately associate with eugenics.
I think so too. I think that, most people's association is heavily the Holocaust. And that's sort of always their frame. And so to try and conceptualize it in an American conception, because they've completely, this isn't taught in our history books for most high school students, especially.
Oh, no.
And even some college students don't know anything about the eugenics movement in America. And so trying to conceptualize it within American frame is almost like putting a fish out of water for a lot of people. They're like, what would it look like? And it's like, no, we had it. And we still do have it.
We had it. And it looks like us, abridging women's reproductive freedom. And that's what it looks like.
It looks
for a long time.
The state where you live, right? And the state where I was born and raised.
Like Texas. Yeah.
Yep. And there's a thing, right? I was struggling with that myself. I live in LA. I've lived in LA now for over 10 years, but I was born and raised in Texas. I grew up in Plano, Texas. I went to the University of North Texas for both my undergrad and my master's. I lived there until I was 25 years old. And my entire family still lives in Texas. And I'm looking at internship sites right now. And I'm mostly applying to LA internship sites. And the only psycho-oncology internship site I could find was MD Anderson, but I'm not going there.
Oh, wow.
And that's like a personal decision where I'm like, I can't risk a year of my life in a place where I don't have reproductive freedom. It scares me.
Yeah.
It like literally scares me.
Which I
And
think
that
it should
is eugenics.
be. Yeah. Yeah. Where it's, what is it? What is the modern day situation of men abridging reproductive rights because they think they know what's best for society, and it's not women picking sperm donors, right? It is the reproductive rights.
It's not the empowerment of choice by the people whose bodies are actually affected.
Yes.
And that, I think that comes down to the main question. And, obviously this is a political philosophy question. So it's so funny that as a psychologist and, an individual who studies, does twin studies and looks at genetic association studies, that you are then facing these social philosophy and political philosophy fundamental issues, these Lockean and Hobbesian issues that are basically like, at what point, and that becomes the crux of the argument, right? Was at what point do individual rights, freedoms, abilities to pursue happiness butt up against social order, norms, and requirements? And how can we sort of ensure and promote a culture and a society that is inclusive, that celebrates diversity, and that ensures these freedoms and these privileges to pursue happiness for everybody, only to the point where they no longer infringe on the freedoms and the privileges for anybody?
Yeah.
And that's hard.
It's very
and it feels
hard.
Like it's what we tried to do at the beginning. It's the narrative of what the American cultural kind of experiment was. But ultimately, when you actually look at the outcome, it's a meritocracy. We live in a meritocracy.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know to what extent your listeners are aware of this, that even the word meritocracy was originally coined by a socialist writer in the UK who meant it as a dystopian term, right? Like it would be a dystopia if we ended up as a meritocracy, because amongst other things, it would deprive us of class solidarity. If we remove from every class, they're the ones who happen to do really good in school and sort of shunt them up to a technocratic class. So what is that corrosive to society as a whole? He wrote this great article, and I think it was in the Guardian newspaper in 2004. Michael Young is the writer. And he said, it's very hard in a meritocracy to be conceptualized as having none, as having no merit, of being meritless. And then he said, no underclass has ever been left so morally naked as that. And I just thought that was such a compelling way to think about the harms that our narratives of meritocracy do. And I'm not the only one. It's interesting. I started this book, 3 years ago. And while I was writing it, it just seemed like there was this ever increasing sort of crescendo of anti-meritocracy books, the myth of meritocracy and the tyranny of merit and the twilight of the elites. So I think you're seeing, people who are coming at this topic from very different perspectives, political philosophy versus genetics versus journalism, who are converging on this idea that our narratives around merit and deservingness are really not answering the big questions about inequality in America today.
Right. And how could we not see this given the sort of historical, this whole, we have to learn from history or we'll be doomed to repeat it. And we're repeating it right now in America.
We repeat it all the time.
Yeah, we do. And we're literally watching the French Revolution. We're watching all these examples of, to sit here and literally see Jeff Bezos launch his ass into space, come back and go, that was cool. I'm so glad that all of my poor employees worked really hard for low wages to make it possible for me to do that. Because that's basically what he said. He was like, I did this because my workers are willing to work
because I'm a capitalist and because
Yeah.
I've been willing to like squeeze every bit of excess value out of people's labor.
And he's like,
that has allowed me to hoard massive amounts of wealth. 100%.
yeah. And then he's like,
what
what can I do with my massive amounts of hoarded wealth? The most ludicrous display that one can possibly
display. Let's be clear.
Imagine. And yet he does this on TV, and there's almost, I mean, I'm not saying there's no social criticism. Of course there is, but there's still like a tacit acceptance that like, cool, rich boy gonna be rich. And then you're like, no wonder people are literally like, you know, burning with rage and striking left and right, and that there's violence and you know, when we see these like social unrest, and then of course you have these arguments about like quote looting or these different, and it's like, what do you expect? What do you expect when the social class system is so stratified, and when individuals with differences are made to maintain in there? It's a caste system in America. Like, it's an overt system in India. And it's not as bad as it was, but it's still pretty damn bad. And Angela Saini writes about it very beautifully in her books. This concept of a caste system, a feudal system. You were endowed with these things because of your family and your history and your pedigree. And so you shall be in this caste and have these privileges afforded to you. You are in this other caste and you're going to live in squalor. And we want to think that America is the antithesis to that, but it's not.
Yeah. I mean, we have,
it could be, but it's not.
I mean, even if we just look at like rates of intergenerational mobility, right? Like, you know, to what extent is your income or your education level different than your parents? We see that in the US, it's lower than many other high income countries. When I think about the kind of how caste works in America, one thing that I'm trying to call attention to is, to the extent that people are thinking about it in this way, you know, in the way of like in kind of in terms of privilege and oppression, there are these very visible sort of markers, right? We can think of class, we can think of disability status, we can think of race as these things that, you know, shape your position in this American hierarchy. Where I think is underappreciated often is that education and the psychological factors that make school easier for you or harder for you operates in a very similar way, in just a strong way, right? Like if we think about, you know, the longevity differences, how long do people literally live, right? What are their risks of dying in midlife? What we're seeing is that the racial gaps are actually getting smaller over time. The education gaps are getting bigger, right? The people who are living shorter lives, even before the coronavirus pandemic, are white, non-college educated, particularly men, who are dying of, you know, what Anne Case and Angus Deaton have called deaths of despair. So we have this stratification by class, we have the stratification by race, we have the stratification by disability, but we also have the stratification by education that is getting worse with every passing year, and not just in income, but also in health, in psychological health and mortality. And so again, like so often people think of genetics as sort of antithetical to thinking about these like these environmental structures. Whereas I think of genetics as a tool that allows us to see these dimensions of inequality that are sometimes that sometimes sort of operate more invisibly in our society.
And I think that comes down to the fact that you understand genetics as it is, that it is a probabilistic concept, and that you understand the kind of risk analysis. Whereas a lot of people, going back to the very beginning, when they hear the word genetics, they think determinism. And that's a completely different view, because of course, then if they're thinking of determinism as the variable within this algorithm, then that is problematic. But that's not what genetics is.
No, it's not. Like, at least not with anything that psychologists study. We've chosen the most complicated aspects of humanity to study. Complicated philosophically, but also complicated scientifically too, I think.
And so I can only imagine, maybe you're not comfortable talking about this, maybe you are, but one of the things I've gone so far over too. So I've got to wrap it up. I can't keep you all day. But one of the things that, is like an obvious solution to a lot of these problems comes down to social programs. Like, it comes down to things like universal healthcare, universal education, even universal basic income. Like, that when we start to minimize the sort of meritocratic view that, oh, this person, quote, worked harder and that's why they're ahead, and not like, that it's that whole Obama, like, you didn't build that or whatever he said. Like, it's like, yeah, okay. So the rich white kid went to Harvard and he, it's like, oh, but I started an empire and I did it all by myself. It's like, yeah, with a loan for $5 million from your parents or whatever, all by yourself.
Yeah.
That when we start to really dismantle a lot of those things and say, okay, everybody has the same opportunities to get their health serviced, and to not be ill. Everybody has the same opportunities to get a basic education or to put food in their mouths and to feed their family. That a lot of these disparities do start to not completely level out, but I mean, we see this all the time in countries where there are universal programs in place, that the class rifts are smaller.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think genetics kind of has two roles to play in this conversation moving forward. And one is, okay, well, we know that people who are advantaged economically, their kids do better in school, right? And they're psychologically healthier, and and they're physically healthier. Actually kind of reverse engineering what are the components, what are the mechanisms of that can then be replicated and scaled, particularly for children later in development, is a really hard scientific problem.
But such an important one.
It's such an important one.
Instead of going like, how do we remove these other people and just make it so that these sort of privileged people are the only class, which is what the kind of worst parts of eugenics did.
Like that was like the original eugenic frame. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, then it's saying, why don't we learn about these things that are helping these people maintain their privilege and apply those things to the people who don't have it?
Yeah. And so genetics there just turns out to be like one of a whole suite of research tools that psychologists can use when they're trying to figure out what causes what in the world, like what parenting practice or what school practice actually increases your reading ability at age 7. Genetics won't solve that problem, but it can be one tool that you can bring to bear for that problem.
Right. It's why we integrated schools, because we realized that separate did not mean equal, and that the only way to have equality of educational opportunities was to integrate. And of course, it still didn't solve the problem, but it made a massive step forward. And that, I think, is almost a perfect example of what you're talking about. Like, what is it that the white kids who are faring so much better have that the Black kids don't? Well, they have the more money in their schools, they have the teachers, they have the whatever. So let's not just say, let's do that. So let's bring it together. And I think that was a sort of an attempt to try and do exactly what you just mentioned.
Yeah. So that's like a really pragmatic application of genetics. And then I think there's a more rhetorical one, which is what we've been talking about, which is, to what extent, if you keep genetics in the foreground of people's minds, in this kind of reminder of the moral arbitrariness of their functioning and the ways in which their brain has been privileged over other brains, does that, pop the balloon a little bit of this sort of self-regard that can inflate people's, like, I deserve this, and the meritocracy. So I think genetics plays both a pragmatic function and a rhetorical function. And we need to keep both of those in mind in our conversations about inequality.
Yeah. Well, All right, Paige. I close every episode by asking my guests the same 2 questions.
Okay.
And I am going to be I'm just like fascinated and really interested in what you have to say. There's a part of me that feels like I can kind of guess, but I always love the curveballs too. So these are big picture questions. Are you ready for me to throw them at you?
I don't know about if I can be ready, but yes, go for it.
Exactly. All right. So I want you to think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you. Obviously, you've done that quite a bit in your work and in writing this book. But if you want to take a left turn, that's okay by me. So whatever context is relevant to you, I want you to answer first. What is the thing that is keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned about, worried, pessimistic, maybe even cynical about. And then on the flip side of that, to end on a slightly more positive note, where are you finding your optimism? Do you have hope? And where, and I mean this from a truly sort of earnest and authentic perspective, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah. I would say on the what keeps me up at night has nothing to do with genetics, and it's
Okay.
really around it's really around climate. That's the thing that when I think about my children's lives, when I think about projecting out 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I'm in that kind of mid-career stage in which I talk to my financial planner about my retirement. And, I think about as I get close to 40, is there any possibility I would have another child? And the thing that's weighing in the background of all of those conversations for me is, what is the earth going to be like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? So that's the biggest source of worry and despair in my life right now. In terms of things that give me optimism, I'll pick 2. And one is I am loving the labor movements that are happening in the US right now, the strikes, the great resignations, the people who are saying, I deserve more. And not by virtue of my merit, but by virtue of my humanity. I think that is really exciting to see. And also, I teach freshmen and I love my freshmen. I really feel like being around college students is so energizing for me. There's many narratives around college kids today as these kind of like coddled snowflakes or something. And that just does not comport with my personal experience at all. I think that they do push back against me when they feel like that I've gotten something wrong. And I'm defensive. And then I'm like, oh, wow, I really learned something from that exchange. And they are, they just really advocate for themselves and for what they think is right in a way that seems even more energetic than what I saw when I first started teaching. And I really am excited to see what the 18 to 26-year-olds of today will do as they seize more political power. I think they're our way forward.
I love that. Well, everyone, the book is The Genetic Lottery: Why DNA Matters for Social Equality by Dr. Kathryn Paige Harden. Paige, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a delightful conversation. I really love it when someone reflects back the thesis of my book kind of even more articulately than I could have. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, right. But that's so kind of you to say. Thank you. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.